Yeah, so I've spent the entire afternoon thinking about um, what the Russian flags that are being hoisted in some of the northern cities, in Nigeria, what it means, what sort of geopolitical consequences that has, and if that somehow speaks to a bit of Russian influence or interference, in the protests that are happening in Nigeria. And I've been, quite bothered, considerably so. And I'm sure that a lot of well-meaning Nigerians have also been quite concerned about seeing those flags being hoisted such brazen and reckless impunity across several cities in northern Nigeria. Um, and I'm trying to make sense of this, and I hope that you have some other geopolitical experts who are looking into this and who are trying to make sense of this, trend. But you see, what I think is happening to a very large extent, and pardon me, because this is a superficial analysis of what I think is happening, in northern Nigeria with many of the flags that you're seeing being hoisted. Now, you will recall that, in the early days of the President Tinubu administration, where there were talks about restoring democracy in Niger, and I think it was in Chad, when the coup happened, and you saw the alignment or realignment of senators in northern Nigeria, northern elders who rallied round and ensured that the president did not take anything close to a military action to restore democracy, in Niger. And the reason why that happened was because not just it's not just the fact that northern Nigeria shares a lot of borders with Niger, but communities across those borders have historical ties that go back centuries. They see themselves as first cousins, if not brothers and sisters, and so they've traded for centuries. They've intermarried, and in fact, in many places, they do not even recognize the borders. And so the argument at the time was that if you took military action in Niger, you essentially were taking military action in northern Nigeria. And of course, that pressure succeeded, and the president, pursued a different strategy entirely as regards restoring democracy in Niger. But where I'm going is that if you looked at the crisis that has engulfed northern Nigeria over the last decade, and particularly the issue of banditry in northwestern Nigeria, what has happened over the last decade is that the crisis and the displacement of Nigerian citizens in the northwestern part of the country, many of whom have now migrated into Chad, northern Cameroon, and Niger Republic. And the estimates, the current estimates, are that over 200,000 Nigerians have migrated to Niger, in the last 8 years. Now, those are very conservative figures because many analysts have argued that over 400,000 Nigerians are currently living in Niger Republic. Now, what does that mean? That obviously means that at least 200,000 Nigerians who have moved in the last 2 years are now living under the military dictatorship in Niger Republic that is now, strongly and has very strong Russian influence. So where's the connection? I think about 4 years ago, the Nigerians started a project, called Opportunity Villages that try to integrate migrants, into and web them into the local fabric of Niger Republic. And you have many of them in small villages, particularly close to, I think, between 25 to 70 kilometers from Maradi. Some pockets close to Agadez, but they are predominantly close to Maradi. And what these opportunity villages essentially do is to integrate people who have migrated from places like Nigeria, largely due to conflict, from places like Burkina Faso, from places like Mali, and to integrate them into the Nigerian community. And they do that by creating business opportunities for trade. They are giving stipends. I think the UN Refugee Commission is also partnering with the Nigerian government to do this. Now, if you think about it critically, if you have 200,000 Nigerians who have left Katsina, Zamfara, Kaduna, who have completely lost everything and who have been abandoned, you know, who feel they have been abandoned by the Nigerian state and, you know, been attacked by bandits and criminals, and they now have to move to Niger, where they are living in somewhat better conditions than the refugees in Nigeria are living, and where there is a deliberate effort from the government to provide not just relief materials like food, water, and shelter, but to also integrate them into the society by providing business opportunities and monthly stipends. Then you begin to see that this group of Nigerians will start to view governance and stability in Niger with a much better light than they do in Nigeria. And perhaps, and this is not, you know, this is not a conclusion. Perhaps I think that that has played deeply into the sentiments in northern Nigeria, where they feel like many of their brothers who continue to flee from northwestern parts of the country are finding succor in Niger, and they are finding a lot more stability in that country than they do in northwestern Nigeria. And to that extent, there is the argument or the tendency to believe that it's the military regime in that country that is providing that stability, and it's their new partners in Russia that is also ensuring that that stability is sustained. And perhaps that has played into the sentiments that you're seeing in northern Nigeria. That could play a significant role in many of the chants that you're hearing in the streets in Kaduna and in Kano. And I really and truly will appreciate if other geopolitical thinkers weigh into this conversation. But I think it's also very important, you know, to unravel what these influences are. Again, I think it's important to also point that Niger has long served as a transit point for people who are traveling to Libya who want to connect to Europe. And I think it was in 2015, there was a bill that was passed, which essentially, I think it was an anti-migration bill, which essentially criminalized, you know, people who supported migrants who were trying to travel from Niger into Libya and into Europe. And what that did was essentially crippled the entire, or a lot of businesses around, you know, Agadez, and many businesses were crippled because that city, you know, provided a lot of the migrant travel provided a lot of business opportunities for people across that city. Hotel services, you know, all sorts of services were being provided. And that particular bill or that particular law seemed to have crippled a lot of these business activities. Now, when the military junta got into office, one of the first things that they did was to repeal that law. And there seems to be a restoration of activities. Businesses are beginning to pick up in Agadez, and that has somehow shored up the support, you know, of the military in that area. Now, what it also means is that, you know, there are arguments that, you know, that bill was sponsored or instigated by European countries who wanted to stop the migration flow or migrant flow into Europe. And now that the military have taken over and that bill has been repealed, a lot of migrants across the Sahel region who are trying to access Libya and perhaps Europe, you know, are beginning to feel like the Russian influence that has influenced the military junta to repeal that law is something that is quite popular with many of these migrants who are being displaced and who are trying to access Europe via Libya. So, I mean, if you put all of these things together, you can sort of get a sense of why you will see the growing, do I call it the growing tilt, towards um, Russia and many of the chants that you're hearing on the streets of northern Nigeria. And of course, you know that Western countries have been deeply, deeply unpopular, massively unpopular in northern Nigeria, just as they have been massively unpopular in the Sahel. And so perhaps you put all of this together and you probably might make sense out of, you might make a bit of sense of what we're seeing on the streets in northern Nigeria. And like I said, I'd like to hear what other geopolitical thinkers are seeing and making sense out of this. But all in all, I think that it's important for our intelligence agencies and security agencies and diplomats to pay very close attention to what is currently happening in the streets of northern Nigeria.